Number 1. John Christie. In the quiet terrace streets of post-war Notting Hill, behind the ordinary front door of 10 Rillington Place, a soft-spoken man named John Reginald Halliday Christie turned his ground-floor flat into a private killing ground. Born in 1899 in Yorkshire, Christie grew up under a harsh father and developed into a petty criminal with a history of theft and violence long before the war. During the conflict he served as a special police constable, a position that gave him a thin cloak of respectability while he lived with his wife Ethel in that cramped London house. Neighbors saw a mild, hypochondriac clerk who complained of various ailments and spoke in a quiet, almost timid voice. They had no idea that the same man was already burying women in the tiny communal garden behind the property. His first known victim was 21-year-old Ruth First, an Austrian munitions worker who sometimes sold sex to survive. In August 1943, while Ethel was away visiting relatives, Christie invited Ruth back to the flat. According to his later accounts, he strangled her with a length of rope during intercourse on the bed. He hid her body under the living room floorboards overnight, then the next evening dug a shallow grave in the garden and buried her there. The thrill of absolute power over a dying woman took hold. A little over a year later he carefully prepared for the next one. Muriel Eady was 31 or 32, a colleague from the radio factory where Christie worked. She suffered from bronchitis. Christie told her he had medical knowledge and a special mixture that would clear her chest. He invited her to the flat, made tea, and had her sit with a scarf over her head while she inhaled from a jar. Inside the jar was Friar's balsam to mask the smell. A tube connected to the domestic gas supply fed carbon monoxide into the mixture. Within a minute Muriel grew weak and lost consciousness. Christie then raped her and strangled her with a stocking while she was still alive. He dragged her body to the washhouse, dug another hole in the garden beside Ruth's grave, and buried her fully clothed. Years later, when the garden was excavated, one of the women's thigh bones was found propping up a section of fence. Christie had used it as a casual support. For 5 years the killing stopped, or at least no more bodies from that period have been identified. Then in 1948 a young Welsh couple, Timothy and Beryl Evans, moved into the top floor flat with their infant daughter Geraldine. Beryl became pregnant again and was desperate. Christie, presenting himself as a man with medical skill, offered to perform an abortion using his special gas. On November 8, 1949 he gassed Beryl into unconsciousness, raped her and strangled her. He later killed the 13-month-old Geraldine as well, strangling the baby with a man's tie. Both bodies were wrapped and hidden in the outdoor washhouse. When Timothy returned from work, Christie told him Beryl had died during the procedure and that they must dispose of the body. Confused, poorly educated, and of limited intelligence, Timothy eventually went to the police. Under pressure his statements changed. Christie and Ethel gave evidence against him. The jury believed the quiet downstairs neighbor. Timothy Evans was convicted of murdering his daughter and hanged at Pentonville Prison on March 9, 1950 by Albert Pierre Point. An innocent man died so that Christie could keep his secret. Christie continued living in the house. In December 1952 his marriage had deteriorated further. Ethel suffered from rheumatism and depression. On the morning of December 14 Christie strangled her in bed with a stocking. He claimed she had been convulsing and that he only wanted to put her out of her misery, but the act was deliberate. He wrapped her body in a blanket and a pillowcase, then forced it under the floorboards of the front room. He forged her signature, emptied her bank accounts, sold her jewelry, and told neighbors she had gone away to relatives. The smell of decay began to rise. Christie tried to mask it with strong disinfectant. With Ethel gone, the pace quickened. Between mid-January and early March 1953, he brought 3 more women back to the almost empty flat. Rita Nelson was 25, 6 months pregnant, and visiting her sister in the area. Christie offered help with a termination. He gassed her, raped her, and strangled her. Kathleen Maloney, 26, a local prostitute, met the same fate weeks later. Hectorina McLennan, also 26, was looking for a place to stay with her boyfriend. Christie offered to sublet, then changed his mind and killed her when she returned. All 3 were rendered unconscious with carbon monoxide, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Christie stacked their bodies in a narrow kitchen alcove behind a cupboard, covered them, and papered over the entrance. The last body went in only days before he decided to leave. In March 1953 Christie sublet the flat and moved out, wandering London's cafes and cheap lodgings. The new tenant, clearing rubbish and peeling wallpaper, discovered the hidden pantry door. Police found the 3 women in various stages of decomposition, still wearing fragments of clothing, one with a piece of cloth between her legs like a diaper. Further searching revealed Ethel under the floorboards and the skeletal remains of Ruth First and Muriel Eady in the garden. Christie was recognized and arrested on March 31 near Putney Bridge. He confessed to multiple murders, including Beryl Evans, though he remained inconsistent about the baby. Tried only for the murder of his wife, Christie pleaded insanity. Doctors described a hysterical personality but not legal insanity. The jury took little more than an hour to find him guilty. On July 15, 1953, at the same prison where Timothy Evans had died 3 years earlier, Albert Pierre Point hanged John Christie. Outside the gates a crowd waited. The mild man who had once worn a special constable's armband had turned a single London address into a graveyard, murdered at least 8 people, framed an innocent tenant, and left a trail of carbon monoxide, ligature marks, and hidden corpses that still stands as one of the most coldly calculated series of killings in British criminal history. The house itself was later demolished, the street renamed, but the facts remain. A quiet predator who used the appearance of help and medical knowledge to lure women into a flat where the only cure he offered was death. Number 2. Patrick Kearney. Patrick Wayne Kearney looked like the last man anyone would fear. Born in 1939 in East Los Angeles, he was a slight, quiet child who endured constant bullying for his small frame and sickly nature. Those early humiliations hardened into private rage. As a young man he briefly married, divorced, and drifted into engineering work at Hughes Aircraft, where supervisors called him a model employee, diligent, precise, and almost invisible. He lived for years with his partner David Hill in Redondo Beach and earlier in Culver City. To the outside world he was an ordinary gay man with a steady job and a quiet home. Inside he had already begun killing. His first known murders date back to 1962. He picked up young men, sometimes hitchhikers, sometimes men he met in bars or cruising spots, and drove them to isolated places. Without warning he shot them in the head with a small caliber pistol, often a .22 Derringer. The method was deliberate and efficient. Later he refined it into something even colder. While driving along Southern California freeways with his left hand on the wheel, carefully maintaining the speed limit so no one would notice anything unusual, he would raise the gun with his right hand and fire a single shot into the temple of the passenger beside him. The body would slump. Kearney would prop it upright and continue driving until he found a private location. There the real ritual began. Kearney was a necrophile. He undressed the corpses and sexually violated them. Only after that did he turn to the work of disposal. Using a hacksaw he dismembered the bodies with the same methodical care he brought to his engineering job. He drained blood to reduce odor, sometimes washed the severed parts in a bathtub, then wrapped the remains in heavy-duty industrial trash bags sealed with filament tape. He scattered the bags along freeways in canyons, landfills, and desert stretches across Los Angeles, Orange, Riverside, San Diego, and Imperial counties. Animals sometimes scattered what the bags did not fully contain. The pattern earned him the name the trash bag killer, though for years police struggled to connect the scattered finds. The pace increased in the mid-1970s. By then Kearney was killing roughly once a month. Victims were almost always young men and teenage boys, hitchhikers, runaways, men looking for anonymous encounters in the gay community. Some were as young as 5 or 8. He selected them for vulnerability and for a resemblance, he later suggested, to the boys who had tormented him in childhood. He took no pleasure in prolonged suffering. The kill was quick, one shot to the head. The violation of the body came after death. Then the saw. Then the bags. Then the long drive to dump the pieces where they might never be fully identified. One of the last confirmed victims was 17-year-old John Otis LeMay. On March 13, 1977, LeMay came to the Redondo Beach house looking for Hill. Kearney invited him inside to watch television. Without provocation he shot the teenager in the back of the head. He dismembered the body, drained it, and packed the parts into 5 trash bags. On March 18 some of those remains were found south of Corona near a highway. LeMay had told friends he was going to see the 2 men known as Pat and Dave. That tip brought detectives to the house. They collected carpet fibers and pubic hair samples that matched evidence on the bags. They also found a blood-stained hacksaw. Arrest warrants followed. Kearney and Hill fled briefly to Texas, then thought better of it. On July 1, 1977 the pair walked into the Riverside County Sheriff's Office. Kearney pointed to a wanted poster and said, in effect, that was him. Hill was eventually cleared of any direct involvement in the murders and released. Kearney began talking. He confessed in detail to 28 killings and later added more, bringing his claim total as high as 35. He led investigators to old dumping sites and burial spots, including skeletal remains near a former Culver City residence. prosecutors could solidly prove 21 cases. Kearney pleaded guilty to those 21 first-degree murders and received 21 consecutive life sentences. He has remained in California prisons ever since, most recently at Mule Creek State Prison. The engineering precision that made him valuable at Hughes Aircraft was the same quality that allowed him to kill for 15 years without attracting notice. He studied other cases, including the Houston murders of Dean Corll, and refined his own methods to minimize risk. He kept normal working hours. He returned home. He disposed of evidence carefully. The freeways that carried ordinary people to jobs and beaches also carried him and his victims, the bodies sitting upright beside him until he found a quiet place to finish what he had started with a single shot. The trash bags left along those roadsides were the only signature most of his victims ever received. A practical, industrial packaging for the remains of young men whose lives ended in the passenger seat of a quiet engineer's car. Number 3. Anthony Sowell. In the rundown Mount Pleasant neighborhood of Cleveland, Ohio, the three-story house at 12205 Imperial Avenue stood next to a longtime family sausage factory on a street already worn down by poverty and neglect. For years neighbors complained of a thick, sickening stench that hung in the air, especially in the summer heat, a smell so strong it made people gag on the sidewalk and forced workers in nearby shops to keep windows shut. City crews flushed sewers and drains repeatedly. Inspectors forced the sausage plant, Ray's Sausage Company, to install new grease traps, replace sewer lines and overhaul ventilation at a cost of tens of thousands of dollars. Workers inside scrubbed constantly with bleach until the place reeked of cleaner instead of meat, yet the foul odor never left. Some residents blamed the sewers. Others pointed at the factory. No one guessed the true source was the quiet man living next door, a registered sex offender named Anthony Edward Sowell who had turned the house into a private graveyard filled with the decomposing bodies of the women he had strangled. Sowell was born on August 19, 1959, in East Cleveland and raised in a turbulent home marked by absence and violence. His father was largely out of the picture, an alcoholic and petty criminal who left Sowell and his siblings to be raised by their mother and grandmother. Relatives later described physical abuse by his mother. Accounts from family indicated that as a child of about 11 he began sexually abusing a young niece who lived in the same household. At 18 he enlisted in the Marine Corps and served nearly 7 years, training as a sharpshooter and rising through the ranks to staff sergeant before receiving an honorable discharge in January 1985. He returned to a changed East Cleveland, one already struggling with the crack epidemic. Drinking and violence followed quickly. In 1988 he was arrested for domestic violence. In July 1989 he lured a 21-year-old pregnant woman from a motel to his home on Page Avenue, bound and gagged her with a necktie, choked her until she could barely breathe, threatened to kill her, and raped her twice. He pleaded guilty to attempted rape and received a sentence of 5 to 15 years in Ohio State Prison. He served the full 15 years and walked free in June 2005. Within 2 years the killing began in earnest. He settled into his late father's house at 12205 Imperial Avenue. The victims were almost all black women from the same struggling East Side community, many of them mothers battling crack cocaine addiction, some living only blocks away, others drifting through temporary housing or the streets. He offered what they needed most in the moment: drugs, alcohol, a place to get high without judgment. Once inside, the pattern was the same. He overpowered them, raped them, and strangled them. Some died by manual strangulation hard enough to fracture the hyoid bone in the neck. Others were killed with ligatures fashioned from whatever was at hand: belts, rope, an electrical charger cord, knotted cloth, even the strap of a shoulder bag. Several bodies were found still wearing those makeshift nooses. Most of the women were left nude. He made no effort to hide the evidence of sexual assault. The first known victim was Crystal Dozier, a 38-year-old mother of 7 who vanished in May 2007. She had been the responsible one in her family, the one relatives called the little mother hen, until the death of one of her children pushed her deeper into addiction. Her remains were later dug from a shallow grave in the backyard, wrapped in layers of translucent plastic and bound tightly with black coaxial cable and gray duct tape, a cloth ligature still knotted around her neck and her wrists tied above her head as if she had fought hard. Next came Tishana Culver, 31, who lived only 4 houses down the street. She had trained in cosmetology and as a nursing assistant, held jobs and tried repeatedly to rebuild her life, but addiction and the suicide of a boyfriend pulled her under. She disappeared in June 2008. Her body was found in a crawl space, fully clothed, the only one recovered that way, with clear signs of a violent struggle and a fractured hyoid bone. LaShanda Long, the youngest at 25 and a mother of 3, vanished in August 2008. Only her skull was ever found, wrapped in a paper bag and placed inside a red plastic bucket in the basement. The rest of her body has never been recovered. Michelle Mason, 45, went missing on October 8, 2008. Her family put up missing person flyers that some believe Seoul tore down. Tonya Carmichael, 53, the oldest of the known victims, disappeared the following month after telling a friend she was going out for a little fun. She had taken classes at community college, earned a real estate license, and worked as a medical secretary between periods of addiction. Kim Yvette Smith, 44, was reported missing in January 2009. Imelda Hunter, 47, and Nancy Cobbs, 45, both vanished in April. Cobbs had worked construction and left behind 3 children and 5 grandchildren. Talacia Fortson, 33, a mother of 3 who attended church and liked flower arranging, disappeared in early June after losing custody of her children to the same addiction that led her to Seoul's door. Janice Webb, 48, followed that same month. The last known victim, Diane Turner, 48, was last seen in late September 2009. Their bodies filled every available space in the house and yard. 2 lay decomposing on the 3rd floor near Seoul's bedroom. Others were stuffed into crawl spaces or the basement under dirt. 5 more were buried in shallow graves in the unpaved backyard. Some were gagged with their own clothing. Some had their ankles bound. The smell of death rose through the floorboards and out into the street for more than 2 years while families searched and city officials looked the other way. Seoul was required to register as a sex offender and check in annually with the sheriff's office, yet he continued to move freely through the neighborhood, sitting on his porch, collecting scrap metal and inviting women inside. Survivors later described attacks in which he choked them unconscious, tied them up, and threatened to kill them if they told anyone. One woman who escaped in September 2009 after he raped and assaulted her told police what had happened, but earlier reports from other survivors had not led to immediate action. Another survivor's detailed statement finally forced police to obtain a warrant. On October 29, 2009, officers arrived at the house. Seoul was not home. Inside a 3rd-floor room they found 2 badly decomposed female bodies covered in flies. Over the next several days cadaver dogs and then a backhoe revealed the rest of the horror. A body under a mound of dirt in the basement, another in a plastic bag, 1 in a crawl space, 5 more in the backyard, and that single skull in a bucket. 11 women in total. At least 8 had been strangled by ligature or by hand. Nearly all showed traces of cocaine or other drugs in their systems. Autopsies later confirmed the use of household objects as murder weapons and the careful wrapping of several bodies in plastic and tape before burial. Police arrested Seoul on Halloween, October 31, 2009, about a mile from the house after a tip that a man matching his description was walking nearby. He was charged with 11 counts of aggravated murder along with dozens of counts of rape, kidnapping, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence. At trial in the summer of 2011, the jury heard the grim details of how he selected vulnerable women from his own community, how he killed them inside the house where he lived, and how he stored their remains while the neighborhood breathed the smell of their decay. They convicted him on 82 of 85 counts, including all 11 murders. The jury recommended death. The judge imposed the sentence and set an execution date that would never come. Seoul spent the rest of his life on death row at Chillicothe Correctional Institution, filing appeals that were denied. On February 8, 2021, he died at age 61 of a terminal illness in a prison hospital, having never faced the lethal injection chamber. The house on Imperial Avenue was eventually demolished. The sausage factory that had been wrongly blamed for the stench struggled under the stigma for years, its owners forced to defend a reputation destroyed by the bodies next door. Families of the missing women had reported their loved ones gone, only to feel dismissed because the victims were poor, black, and struggling with addiction. Some had never even been formally listed as missing because relatives assumed they were simply on another binge. For more than 2 years the neighborhood inhaled the smell of 11 murdered women while the man responsible sat on his porch and continued to invite the next one inside with the promise of a high. The Cleveland Strangler did not hunt strangers on dark streets far from home. He lived among the people he destroyed, preyed on the most vulnerable in his own community, and relied on a system that failed to take their disappearances seriously until the bodies could no longer be ignored. Number 4. Robert Hansen. In the remote wilderness outside Anchorage, Alaska, the dense forests, riverbanks and isolated lakes along the Knik River became a private hunting ground for a man the city knew only as a quiet bakery owner, devoted family man, and skilled outdoorsman. Robert Christian Hansen looked harmless. Born on February 15, 1939 in Esterville, Iowa, He grew up under a strict Danish immigrant father who ran the family bakery with an iron fist and demanded absolute obedience. Small for his age, plagued by a lifelong stutter and severe acne that left him scarred, Hansen was bullied relentlessly as a boy. His father forced him to work long hours in the bakery from a young age and even made the naturally left-handed child switch to his right hand, worsening the stutter. Those early humiliations and the constant sense of inadequacy hardened into something far darker. After a brief and troubled early adulthood that included arson charges and a short prison term for which he received psychiatric treatment for manic depression, Hansen moved north to Alaska in the late 1960s with his second wife, Darla, and their children. There he opened Hansen's Bakery, earned a reputation as a mild-mannered, church-going family man who kept to himself, obtained a pilot's license, and bought a small bush plane. He became an avid and successful hunter, filling his home with mounted animal heads, horns, and trophies. No one in Anchorage suspected that the same soft-spoken man who sold them bread and pastries was also hunting human beings for sport. Hansen's crimes began around 1971 and stretched across more than a decade until 1983. He targeted women he considered disposable and unlikely to be missed. Sex workers, exotic dancers, young transients, and teenagers frequenting the rough downtown strips near 4th Avenue during the pipeline boom years. Many were new to Alaska, far from family, and easy to overlook when they simply vanished. His method was calculated and evolved over time. Early on he would stalk a woman, learn her habits, then offer money for sex or claim he wanted to take photographs for modeling work. Once she was in his car he produced a handgun, bound her wrists, and drove her either to his home in the Muldoon area or toward Merrill Field Airport. At the house he sometimes held them captive for hours or days in the basement, chaining them by the neck to a post while he slept on a nearby couch. He raped and tortured them, often forcing them to endure prolonged assaults. Then came the part that defined his particular brand of cruelty. For many of the women who resisted or who simply angered him, Hansen loaded them into his private Piper Super Cub and flew them deep into the Alaskan bush. His preferred hunting grounds were remote stretches along the Nick River, Horseshoe Lake, Figure 8 Lake, and other isolated spots far from any road or chance of rescue. There, in the freezing, mosquito-ridden wilderness, he stripped them completely naked. Sometimes he blindfolded them. He gave them a short head start, just enough time for hope to flicker, then set out after them with a .223 caliber Ruger Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle or a hunting knife. He treated the chase exactly like big game hunting. He later told investigators the experience felt the same as going after a trophy doll sheep or a grizzly bear. The women, barefoot, disoriented, freezing, and terrified, stumbled through dense underbrush and uneven ground while Hansen tracked them at his leisure, sometimes wounding them and letting them crawl before closing in for the final shot. Some of the bodies were found fully clothed even though there were no bullet holes in the fabric, proving he had shot them while they were naked and then redressed them afterward as a final act of control. After the kill he buried them in shallow graves and took jewelry, watches, or small personal items as trophies to keep in his home. Over the years he carefully marked each burial site with a tiny X on an aeronautical chart he hid in his house. At least 17 women died this way, and investigators believe the true number may be higher, possibly more than 20 or even 30. Among the confirmed or strongly linked victims were the unidentified woman known for decades as Eklutna Annie, whose remains were found in a shallow grave near Eklutna Lake Road in 1980, Sherry Morrow, 23, discovered on the banks of the Nick River in September 1982, Paula Golding, Joanna Messina, Sue Luna, Malai Larson, Angela Feddern, Teresa Watson, Delynn Fry, Tamara Peterson, and others whose graves Hansen later pointed out. Some sites on his map never yielded remains because animals had scattered the bones or because the terrain had changed. Hansen admitted to raping more than 30 women in total. Those who did not fight hard enough or who managed to convince him they would never report him, were sometimes driven back to Anchorage and dumped with threats of death if they talked. The ones who struggled, screamed, or simply became inconvenient were flown out and hunted like animals. The breakthrough that finally stopped him came in June 1983. 17-year-old Cindy Paulson, working the streets of Anchorage, was abducted at gunpoint, driven to Hansen's home, chained in the basement and subjected to hours of rape and torture. The next day he drove her to Merrill Field, intending to fly her into the wilderness for the final hunt. While Hansen was loading gear into the plane, Paulson managed to slip her restraints enough to escape. Barefoot, still partially bound and terrified, she ran to a nearby road, flagged down a passing driver and told police everything. She described Hansen in precise detail, including the car, the house, and the plane. She even left her sneakers inside his vehicle as physical evidence. Hansen produced alibis from two friends who later admitted he had asked them to lie for him. For a short time the case stalled while more bodies continued to surface along the rivers. On October 27, 1983, Alaska State Troopers obtained a search warrant and went through Hansen's home, vehicles, and plane while he was brought in for questioning. In the attic, under insulation, they found a hidden cache of weapons that included the .223 Ruger Mini 14, later matched by ballistics to shell casings recovered near several bodies. They also found a revolver matching the description given by Paulson. Hidden behind a panel and in other concealed spots were pieces of jewelry and identification cards belonging to missing women. Most damning of all was the aviation map discovered behind the headboard of his bed. It was covered with 37 small handwritten X marks clustered along the Nick River corridor and other remote areas. Many of those marks matched the exact locations where bodies had already been found. Others pointed to graves that had not yet been discovered. Confronted with the growing mountain of evidence, Hansen initially denied everything. Eventually, facing the certainty of conviction and the possibility of the death penalty, he began to talk. He confessed to 17 murders and more than 30 rapes spanning from the early 1970s to 1983. As part of a carefully negotiated plea agreement, he agreed to lead investigators to the burial sites in exchange for being charged only with the 4 murders that could be proven by ballistics evidence and for serving his time in a federal facility with limited publicity. In the spring of 1984 he flew with troopers by helicopter over the snow-covered landscape, pointing out grave after grave. Bodies and remains of Sue Luna, Malai Larson, Delynn Fry, Teresa Watson, Angela Feddern, Tamara Peterson, and others were recovered from the sites he identified. Not every X on the map produced remains. Some locations had been disturbed by scavengers, and a few Hansen simply refused to discuss. On February 27, 1984, Robert Hansen pleaded guilty to the first-degree murders of Eklutna Annie, Sherry Morrow, Paula Golding, and Joanna Messina, along with the kidnapping and rape of Cindy Paulson. Superior Court Judge Ralph E. Moody sentenced him to 461 years in prison plus a life term, with no possibility of parole. Hansen spent the remaining decades of his life behind bars. He died of natural causes on August 21, 2014, at the age of 75. The mild-mannered baker who once stood behind a counter selling bread and cakes had turned the vast, beautiful Alaskan wilderness into a killing field. He stripped women of their clothes, their dignity, and any realistic chance of survival so he could stalk them through the trees like game animals, shoot them down, and bury them in unmarked graves that only he could find on a map covered in X's. The women he hunted were not abstract victims. They were daughters, sisters, and mothers whose lives ended in terror and cold isolation while the city around them never even realized how many had disappeared. Number 5. Fritz Haarmann. In the aftermath of the First World War, Germany lay in ruins. The streets of Hanover, once proud and orderly, had become a hunting ground for the desperate, the lost, and the forgotten. Thousands of young men, runaways, orphans, and broken soldiers, wandered the train stations with hollow eyes and empty stomachs, searching for something, anything to cling to in a world that had abandoned them. What they didn't know was that a predator was watching them from the shadows. A predator who wore the mask of an officer of the law. A predator who would become one of the most monstrous serial killers in modern history. His name was Friedrich Heinrich Karl Haarmann. The world would come to know him as the Butcher of Hanover. And his story is a descent into a darkness so profound that it still haunts Germany a century later. Fritz Haarmann was born on October 25, 1879, the youngest of 6 children in a household poisoned by violence and dysfunction. His father, a brutal alcoholic railway worker known in the community as Sulky All, was prone to drunken rages and physical abuse. His mother, Johanna, was frail and bedridden, but she adored her youngest son, indulging his every whim, even when that whim included playing with dolls and dressing in his sister's clothing. From the very beginning, Fritz was different, isolated, a boy who preferred the company of knives and the macabre spectacle of butchers at work to the rough play of other children. This early fixation on violence would only grow. In 1895, during a gymnastics exercise at military school, Haarmann suffered a severe concussion that triggered epileptic fits and blackouts. He was discharged, his mind now fractured, his impulses increasingly uncontrollable. He drifted through a series of jobs, a failed marriage, and a string of petty crimes, eventually landing in prison for 5 years for molesting young boys. But prison didn't reform him, it just sharpened his hatred for society. By the time World War I ended, Haarmann was a free man, and the world he returned to was perfect for a predator. Germany was starving, its economy destroyed, its social order collapsed. Hanover, in particular, had become a magnet for homeless and desperate young people. It was a city of shadows. And in those shadows, Harmon found his purpose. Harmon established himself as a dealer of second-hand clothes and meat, operating out of a decrepit attic apartment in a seedy district known as the Ghost District. He was a fleshy man with a Charlie Chaplin mustache and the voice of an old woman, unassuming, almost comical in appearance. But he had an ace up his sleeve. He worked as a police informant, a V-man, helping authorities track down communist agitators in the chaotic post-war years. This arrangement gave him an unshakable alibi. He was untouchable. He was the law. And he used this power to prey on the most vulnerable. Every night, Harmon would wander the Hanover train station, a seemingly helpful figure offering warm meals and a place to sleep to desperate young boys. He would target runaways, orphans, and young men who had lost everything. His victims were aged between 10 and 22 years old, boys and young men who were not yet missed, whose disappearances would go unnoticed in the chaos of a collapsing society. Once he gained their trust, Harmon would escort them back to his attic apartment. There he would feed them, ply them with drink, and then, in a frenzy of sexual sadism, he would attack. His method was almost unimaginably brutal. He would bite his victims through the throat, tearing open their windpipes with his teeth and drinking their blood as they died. In his confessions, he described how his passion was so much stronger than the horror of the cutting and chopping. What happened after the murder was even more grotesque. With a hatchet, Harmon would dismember the body, cutting it into pieces. He later described the process with chilling detachment. He would make 2 cuts in the abdomen, place the intestines in a bucket, soak up the blood, crush the bones until the shoulders broke, and then remove the heart, lungs, and kidneys. The flesh would be stripped from the bones and placed in a waxcloth bag. 5 to 6 trips would be needed to dispose of everything, throwing parts into the toilet, dumping others into the river lane. But the disposal was only part of the horror. Harmon, a former butcher by trade, allegedly began selling the flesh of his victims on the local black market. Rumors spread like wildfire through Hanover's starving neighborhoods. The detective, who sold cheap meat, was actually selling human flesh, disguised as pork or horse meat. Neighbors bought sausages and stews that may have been made from missing children. The police never conclusively proved the origin of his meat, but investigators documented his extensive illegal meat trade and questioned where his supplies came from. Harmon had an accomplice in his atrocities, Hans Granz, a handsome male prostitute 20 years his junior, who was also his lover. Granz would help lure victims, and he was responsible for selling their clothing and possessions. In some cases, Granz allegedly urged Harmon to kill specific victims so he could obtain their clothes. The pair operated in tandem, a monstrous partnership built on blood and greed. The most shocking aspect of the case was the involvement of the police. Harmon was protected by his role as an informant. Officers looked the other way even when they had reason to suspect him. On one occasion, police burst into Harmon's apartment to find him in bed with a young boy. They arrested him on an indecency charge, but completely missed the severed head of one of his victims, which was hidden behind the stove. Harmon later boasted about this near miss. He cheated on thieves and dealers and was close friends with some of the officers, who occasionally took clothes as gifts and looked the other way. For 6 years, from 1918 to 1924, the killing continued. In 1923 alone, almost 600 teenage boys and young men had been reported missing in Hanover. The city was gripped by a silent terror, parents losing their sons, families torn apart, but the authorities did nothing. Harmon was too valuable as an asset. In the spring of 1924, the river lane began to yield its secrets. On May 17, children playing near the Herrenhausen Gardens found a human skull washed up on the bank. A week later, another skull appeared. In June, sacks of bones floated to the surface. By the time police finished dredging the river, they had collected more than 500 human bone fragments from dozens of victims. The horror that had been whispered about in the streets was now undeniable. Even as police began investigating, Harmon continued to kill. But his luck was about to run out. On June 22, 1924, Harmon was spotted at the train station with a 15-year-old boy named Carl From. The two got into an argument, and Harmon tried to have From arrested on false charges. In an ironic twist, From turned the tables and accused Harmon of sexual assault. The next morning, Harmon was finally arrested. The police searched his apartment and found 400 items of clothing, only 100 of which were ever identified as belonging to known victims. The evidence was overwhelming. When interrogated, Harmon confessed to 24 murders, but investigators believed the true number could be much higher. He would only admit to crimes for which there was already evidence, carefully controlling the narrative even in confession. Harmon's trial began on December 4, 1924, and it became one of the most sensationalized legal proceedings in early 20th century Europe. The media drenched the story, labeling him a werewolf, a vampire, and a sexual psychopath. The public was horrified not only by the brutality of the crimes but also by the scandal of police involvement. During the trial, Harmon showed no remorse. In fact, he declared to the jury, "Were I set at liberty, I would murder again. Why I kill is a mystery to me." He claimed to have no memory of many murders, saying, "I simply saw that in the morning there was a corpse next to me." When asked how he felt about the death penalty, he declared, "I will go to the decapitating block joyfully and happily." The defense argued for diminished responsibility, suggesting Harmon should be sent to an asylum. But public opinion was inflamed. The victims were too many, the details too brutal. On December 19, 1924, Harmon was sentenced to death. Hans Granz received 12 years in prison. On April 15, 1925, justice was finally served. Fritz Harmon was led to the guillotine at Hanover Prison. He went to his death without a shred of remorse. His head, preserved in formalin, was stored in Göttingen's forensic medicine department for decades. It was only in 2014, nearly 90 years after his execution, that the head was finally cremated and buried anonymously. The case of Fritz Harmon exposed deep societal fractures in the Weimar Republic. How could a known criminal, a sexual predator, operate for 6 years under the protection of the police? How could a city allow its children to be slaughtered without intervention? The trial shook German society to its core, and Harmon's crimes inspired cultural works that still resonate today. Fritz Lang's classic film M, starring Peter Lorre, was inspired by Harmon and Peter Kürten, another German serial killer. But the true legacy of Harmon lies in the victims, the young boys who trusted him, who took his hand thinking they had found safety, only to be devoured by a monster. They have names: Friedel Roth, Fritz Frank, Ernst Ehrenberg, Roland Hutch, and so many more. Their stories deserve to be told, not to glorify the monster, but to remember the innocent lives he stole. Harmon once claimed that his passion for killing was so much stronger than the horror of the cutting and chopping. But for us, the horror is all we see. The horror of a broken country that abandoned its children. The horror of a system that protected a predator. And the horror of a man who looked into the eyes of boys and saw nothing but meat. Fritz Harmon is dead. But his story remains a warning. When society breaks down, when authority looks the other way, the wolves come out to hunt. And in the ruins of post-war Germany, one wolf wore the uniform of the law. Number 6. Michael Joseph Swango. Michael Joseph Swango was a physician who turned the tools of medicine into instruments of quiet, calculated murder. Born on October 21, 1954, and raised in Quincy, Illinois, he showed an early and unsettling fascination with death, disasters, and poison. He kept scrapbooks filled with newspaper clippings of fatal car wrecks and violent crimes. In college, he wrote a chemistry thesis on the poisoning of Bulgarian dissident Georgy Markov. By the time he reached Southern Illinois University School of Medicine, classmates had already noticed that patients under his care seemed to die at an unusually high rate. They nicknamed him 00 Swango, a bitter joke about a license to kill. The joke would prove prophetic. During his internship at Ohio State University hospitals in Columbus in 1983 and 1984, the pattern became impossible to ignore for those paying close attention. Healthy or recovering patients began dying without clear medical explanation whenever Swango was on the floor. One of the clearest cases was 19-year-old Cynthia Ann McGee, a young woman from Dublin, Ohio, who was recovering from injuries sustained in a car accident. Swango injected her with a lethal dose of potassium chloride that stopped her heart. He later admitted the killing. Other patients suffered sudden seizures, respiratory arrest, or unexplained collapses after he entered their rooms, adjusted their 4 lines, or claimed to be giving routine medication. A nursing student reported seeing him inject something into a patient's line moments before the patient seized and stopped breathing. The patient survived, but the pattern continued. Nurses raised alarms. Hospital administrators conducted limited interviews and then closed ranks, moving Swango to another wing rather than fully confronting the possibility that one of their interns was killing patients. Within a short period, multiple deaths clustered around his shifts. Swango eventually left Ohio under a cloud of suspicion that never fully stuck at the time. He returned to Quincy and took a job with the Adams County Ambulance Service as a paramedic. There he began using his coworkers as test subjects. He mixed arsenic, drawn from taro ant killer, a common household product whose active ingredient was sodium arsenate, into their coffee, iced tea, donuts, and shared snacks. The paramedics grew violently ill with the classic symptoms of arsenic poisoning: vomiting, severe diarrhea, burning abdominal pain, weakness, and neurological symptoms. Several became so sick they required medical attention. They grew suspicious of the soft-spoken colleague who always seemed to be around when the food was left unattended. One day they deliberately left a pitcher of unsweetened iced tea on the counter where they knew Swango would be alone with it. When they returned and tested the tea, it was heavily laced with arsenic. Police obtained a search warrant for his apartment and found what they described as a mini laboratory. Multiple containers of ant poison, handwritten recipes for ricin, botulism toxin, and concentrated cyanide, syringes, chemicals, survivalist knives, handguns, and books on poisons and clandestine methods. In 1985, a jury convicted him of aggravated battery for the poisonings of his co-workers. The judge, Dennis Cashman, stated from the bench that every man, woman, and child was in jeopardy as long as Swango remained free, and sentenced him to 5 years. He served roughly 2 years and was released in 1987. Once free, Swango systematically lied, forged documents, and concealed his conviction in order to regain access to hospitals and patients. He secured a residency position in South Dakota using false papers and incomplete disclosures. When that situation became untenable, he moved on. In the early 1990s, he obtained a psychiatric residency at the State University of New York at Stony Brook by again falsifying his background. As part of that program, he worked at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northport, Long Island. In 1993, 3 patients died under his care in a compressed period: Thomas Samarco, 73, George Ciano, 62, and Aldo Sarini, 62. Swango injected them with substances, including forms of potassium and other agents capable of stopping the heart or inducing paralysis, that caused rapid and fatal deterioration. One nurse later described watching him inject a patient who then collapsed. Swango kept a personal notebook in which he recorded his thoughts about the killings. Prosecutors later read passages in which he described the sweet, husky, close smell of indoor homicide, and claimed that the murders were the only way he could remind himself that he was still alive. The language was clinical, detached, and chillingly pleased with itself. After being forced out of the New York program once his history began to surface, Swango traveled to Zimbabwe and took a position at a Christian mission hospital. Nurses there also noticed that patients under his care died suddenly and without adequate explanation. Zimbabwean authorities later charged him in absentia with poisoning multiple patients, several of whom died. He left Africa before a complete case could be assembled against him and attempted to secure a medical position in Saudi Arabia. In June 1997, while changing planes at Chicago's O'Hare Airport on his way to that job, federal agents arrested him on fraud charges related to the false statements on his medical applications and residency paperwork. While Swango was serving time on the fraud conviction, investigators continued building the murder cases. They exhumed bodies from the Northport VA deaths and found evidence of toxic substances consistent with lethal injections. In July 2000, only days before he was scheduled for release, federal prosecutors in New York charged him with the murders of the 3 veterans and with the earlier killing of Cynthia McGee in Ohio. Facing the real possibility of the death penalty and extradition to Zimbabwe to face additional charges, Swango entered a plea. In September 2000, he pleaded guilty to the 3 New York murders and acknowledged his role in McGee's death. He received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole in the New York case. In Ohio, he received an additional sentence of 20 years to life. He was ultimately housed at the federal supermax prison ADX Florence in Colorado, where he remains. Estimates of his total number of victims range from the 4 he formally admitted to as many as 35 according to detailed journalistic investigation, or as high as 60 according to some law enforcement assessments. The true figure will never be known with certainty. Many of the deaths occurred in hospital settings where patients were already ill or recovering, and the sudden deteriorations were often attributed to natural causes or expected complications. Records from some of the locations where he worked were incomplete or never fully re-examined. What is established beyond dispute is that a licensed physician repeatedly used his position of trust, his knowledge of pharmacology and chemistry, and his access to the most vulnerable people in medical settings to end lives. He poisoned coworkers to study the effects. He injected patients with potassium and other agents to stop their hearts. He forged documents and moved from hospital to hospital, state to state, and continent to continent whenever suspicion grew too strong. Hospitals and medical boards failed repeatedly to stop him. Colleagues who raised alarms were often dismissed or overruled by administrators more concerned with institutional reputation than with the pattern of deaths. Swango exploited a system that preferred not to believe a doctor could be a serial killer. The patients who died under his care never received the chance to recover. The coworkers he poisoned never fully understood why their own colleague was trying to make them sick. The notebook entries remain the clearest surviving window into his mind. A man who found meaning and satisfaction in the act of ending another person's life while wearing a white coat and claiming the authority of medicine. Number 7. Israel Keyes. Israel Keyes operated with a level of discipline and long-range planning that set him apart from most serial killers. Born on January 7, 1978 in Richmond, Utah, and raised in a large fundamentalist Christian family that later settled in a remote cabin without electricity near Colville, Washington, he grew up isolated and homeschooled. By his mid-teens he already understood he was different. He served in the U.S. Army, worked as a contractor, and lived for years in Anchorage, Alaska, appearing to outsiders as an ordinary working man with a young daughter. Beneath that exterior he spent more than a decade traveling thousands of miles across the United States to commit random murders, bank robberies, burglaries, and arsons designed to leave almost no forensic trail. Keyes did not hunt a specific type of victim. He targeted strangers of both sexes and varying ages, choosing them purely for opportunity and the absence of complications such as children or dogs in the household. He funded his travels with cash from bank robberies and his contracting work. Years before many of the crimes, he buried what he called kill kits, large plastic Home Depot buckets filled with guns, ammunition, homemade silencers, zip ties, duct tape, rope, cash, and chemicals such as Drano and lye intended to accelerate the destruction of bodies. These caches were hidden in remote locations across multiple states. When the urge to kill arose, Keyes would fly commercially into a major city, rent a car, dig up a prepositioned kit, select a victim or victims, and then put hundreds or thousands of miles between himself and the crime scene. He avoided credit cards on these trips, removed the battery from his cell phone, and left almost no digital footprint. The 3 victims whose identities are confirmed illustrate the method. In June 2011, Keyes flew from Anchorage to Chicago, rented a car, and drove more than 900 miles to Essex, Vermont. 2 years earlier he had buried a kill kit near the area. On the night of June 8 he broke into the home of Bill Currier, 49, and Lorraine Currier, 55, a couple who fit his criteria of no children and an attached garage. He bound them, forced them into their own vehicle, and drove them to an abandoned farmhouse. There he shot Bill Currier. He sexually assaulted Lorraine Currier and then strangled her. He disposed of the bodies in a way that has prevented their recovery to this day. After the murders he continued traveling along the East Coast before returning to Alaska, leaving investigators with a cold disappearance and no obvious links to any local suspect. Less than a year later, on the night of February 1, 2012, Keyes struck closer to home. He waited outside the Common Grounds espresso kiosk on East Tudor Road in Anchorage where 18-year-old Samantha Koenig worked the late shift. He forced her at gunpoint into his vehicle, took her to a shed on his own property, sexually assaulted her, and strangled her. He left her body in the shed while he went on a 2-week family cruise in the Gulf of Mexico. Upon returning he applied makeup to her face, sewed her eyes open with fishing line, and posed her body with a 4-day-old copy of the Anchorage Daily News to create a ransom photograph that made it appear she was still alive. He demanded $30,000 be deposited into her bank account. After using the photograph, he dismembered her remains and dumped them in Matanuska Lake north of Anchorage. He then began traveling south, using her stolen debit card at ATMs across the Southwest. That decision proved fatal to his freedom. Authorities tracked the withdrawals. On March 13, 2012, Keyes was stopped and arrested in Lufkin, Texas. A search of his rental vehicle turned up Koenig's identification and other incriminating items. Brought back to Alaska, he eventually began talking to investigators. Over dozens of hours of interviews he confessed to the Koenig murder and the Currier murders, and he indicated he had killed as many as 11 people in total between roughly 2001 and 2012. He described additional victims in Washington, New York, and other locations, including cases in which he moved bodies across state lines and staged scenes to look accidental. He admitted to 20 to 30 burglaries and several bank robberies used to finance the travel. He showed investigators the locations of some of his buried kill kits. 2 were recovered, 1 in Alaska and 1 near Blake Falls Reservoir in New York, containing firearms, ammunition, and disposal chemicals. Keyes was meticulous about operational security. He preferred strangulation because he wanted to watch the victim lose consciousness. He used guns only when necessary. He took steps to destroy evidence and to ensure that the people he killed had no connection to his daily life in Anchorage. He told investigators he had once considered building a house where he could hold victims for extended periods, drawing inspiration from historical killers who maintained private killing grounds. He also admitted that by the time of the Koenig murder he had grown careless and out of control, abandoning some of the careful distance that had previously protected him. While in custody awaiting trial for the kidnapping and murder of Samantha Koenig, Keyes continued intermittent interviews but refused to provide the names or precise locations of most of his other victims. He drew 11 skulls in his own blood on a sheet of paper found under his jail bed, one of the few remaining indicators of the number he claimed. On December 1, 2012, he killed himself in his cell at the Anchorage Correctional Complex by cutting his wrists and strangling himself with a bedsheet. He left behind a series of incomplete confessions, unrecovered bodies, and a map of travel that covered dozens of states over nearly a decade. Investigators continue to work open cases that may be linked to Keyes, but many of the details he took to his grave remain unknown. What is established is that a construction contractor living an outwardly ordinary life spent years preparing remote caches of weapons and chemicals, flying and driving across the country, selecting strangers at random, and ending their lives with a degree of planning rarely seen even among the most organized serial killers. The three confirmed victims, Samantha Koenig in Alaska and Bill and Lorraine Currier in Vermont, represent only the portion of his crimes that could be fully proven before he died. The kill kits buried in the ground, the bank robbery cash that funded the travel, and the deliberate crossing of state lines were all designed to make detection nearly impossible. For more than a decade the system did not catch him. Only the use of a single stolen debit card after the final murder brought the methodical traveler to an end. Number 8. Derek Todd Lee. Derek Todd Lee moved through the neighborhoods of Baton Rouge, Zachary, Addis, and the surrounding Louisiana communities with an ease that made him nearly invisible to the people who lived there. Born on November 5, 1968 in St. Francisville, he grew up in a disordered and often violent household. As a young man he accumulated a string of arrests for burglary, stalking, peeping into windows, trespassing, battery and related offenses. He married, fathered children, and held steady blue-collar work as a pipe fitter and concrete finisher. To neighbors and acquaintances he often appeared outgoing, talkative, and non-threatening. That ordinary surface became the cover that allowed him to watch women for days or weeks, learn their schedules, and enter their homes when they were alone. Between 1998 and 2003 Lee killed at least 7 women in South Louisiana. DNA later tied him to the attacks even though he was formally convicted of only 2. The first confirmed case was Randy Jane Mabrewer, a 28-year-old mother living in the Oak Shadow subdivision of Zachary. On the night of April 18 to 19, 1998, while her young child slept in another bedroom, Lee entered the house. Investigators found clear evidence of a violent struggle: blood trails, overturned furniture, and signs that Mabrewer had fought hard. She disappeared that night. Her body has never been recovered. Years later, when DNA technology advanced, material recovered from the scene matched Lee. After a multi-year gap, the killings resumed with greater frequency. On September 23 to 24, 2001, 39-year-old registered nurse Gina Wilson Green was raped and strangled inside her home on Stanford Avenue near the Louisiana State University campus. A coworker grew concerned when Green failed to appear for her shift and went to the house. She found Green's body. The cell phone and purse were missing. The phone was later recovered in an alley on Choctaw Street. DNA left on Green's clothing and on a towel in the home would eventually become part of the genetic profile that identified the serial offender. On January 14, 2002, 21-year-old Geraldine DeSoto was beaten and stabbed to death in her home in Addis. Earlier that same day she had registered for graduate classes at LSU. Her husband returned and discovered her lying in a large pool of blood. DNA recovered from under her fingernails later matched Lee. 4 months later, on May 31, 2002, 22-year-old Charlotte Murray Pace was attacked inside her townhouse on Charlotte Avenue during the middle of the day. Pace had graduated from LSU only a week earlier with an MBA and had just moved into the new residence. She was raped and stabbed more than 80 times. The ferocity of the assault left blood throughout the townhouse. DNA recovered from the scene provided one of the strongest and most complete genetic profiles in the series. On July 12, 2002, 44-year-old antique shop owner Pamela Kinnamore was abducted from her Baton Rouge home. Her body was discovered 4 days later near Whiskey Bay. She had been raped and her throat cut. Defensive wounds showed she had fought her attacker. On November 21, 2002, 23-year-old Trinisha Dean Collum was attacked near Grand Coteau north of Lafayette. Her body was found 3 days later in Scott. She had been beaten to death with blunt force. The final confirmed victim was 26-year-old Carrie Lynn Yoder, an LSU graduate student in biological sciences. On March 3, 2003, she was abducted from her apartment south of the campus while unloading groceries. 10 days later, her body was recovered near Whiskey Bay. She had been beaten, raped, and strangled. Throughout these years, Lee continued to live and work in the same general area. A multi-agency task force was formed to hunt the Baton Rouge serial killer. Behavioral profilers suggested the offender was most likely a white man. That assumption shaped the investigation for months. Thousands of DNA samples were collected from white men who lived or worked near the crime scenes. Lee, who is African American, remained outside the primary pool of suspects even though local officers in Zachary had long considered him a person of interest in earlier unsolved cases, including the 1992 murder of accountant Connie Warner and the Mabrour disappearance. His prior arrests for stalking and voyeurism were known to some detectives but never elevated him to the level of a serial killer suspect while the racial profile remained in force. The breakthrough arrived from two independent directions. On July 9, 2002, a woman named Diane Alexander was attacked inside her home in Breaux Bridge. Lee had gained entry and begun the assault when Alexander's son arrived home from school. The interruption forced Lee to flee. Alexander survived and provided a detailed description that allowed police to produce a composite sketch. Separately, investigators obtained a DNA sample from Lee in connection with an unrelated investigation. On May 25, 2003, the Louisiana State Police Crime Lab confirmed that Lee's DNA matched evidence recovered from multiple scenes, including the murders of Gina Wilson Green, Charlotte Murray Pace, Pamela Kinnamore, Trinisha Collum, and Carrie Lynn Yoder, as well as material from the Mabrour home. An arrest warrant was issued for the murder of Yoder. Lee fled. He traveled first to Chicago and then to Atlanta. U.S. Marshals located and arrested him in Atlanta on May 27, 2003. He was returned to Louisiana and charged with multiple murders. In August 2004, a jury convicted him of the second-degree murder of Geraldine DeSoto. He received an automatic life sentence. Later that year, in a separate trial, he was convicted of the first-degree murder of Charlotte Murray Pace and sentenced to death by lethal injection. DNA evidence also linked him conclusively to the remaining cases, although additional capital prosecutions were not pursued. Appeals of the death sentence were denied by the Louisiana Supreme Court, which described the evidence of the Pace killing as both overwhelming and horrific. On January 21, 2016, Derek Todd Lee died of natural causes at the age of 47 while still incarcerated on death row at the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. The women he murdered were mothers, nurses, students, and working professionals living ordinary lives inside their own homes. Lee used familiarity with the neighborhoods, an ability to appear non-threatening, and the frequent absence of forced entry to reach them. The incorrect racial profile delayed recognition of the true offender for years and allowed the killings to continue. Only the combination of DNA technology and the survival of Diane Alexander finally ended the series. Some of the bodies were recovered. Randy Mabrour's remains have never been located. The cases stand as a clear demonstration of how a predator can operate inside a community for years when the search is aimed in the wrong direction and when prior low-level crimes are not connected to the larger pattern of violence. Number 9. Gary Ray Bowles. Gary Ray Bowles spent 8 months in 1994 moving along the Interstate 95 corridor, leaving a trail of dead men from Florida through Georgia and into Maryland. He targeted older gay men who offered him food, work, or a place to stay. Once inside their homes, he beat them, strangled them, and stuffed objects, towels, rags, toilet paper, leaves, dirt, even a sex toy, down their throats. He stole their cars, cash, and credit cards and kept moving. By the time the FBI placed him on its 10 most wanted list, 6 men were dead. Bowles was born on January 25, 1962, in Clifton Forge, Virginia. His father, a coal miner, died of black lung disease 6 months before he was born. His mother remarried repeatedly. One stepfather was a violent alcoholic who beat Bowles, his mother, and his older brother. Bowles began drinking, smoking marijuana, and huffing glue by age 11. At 13 he fought back, striking the stepfather in the head with a rock and nearly killing him. He ran away from home at 14 and spent years drifting, living on the streets, working as a male prostitute, and accumulating arrests for assault, burglary, and robbery. By the early 1990s he had already served prison time. In March 1994 he was in Daytona Beach, Florida. There he met 59-year-old John Hardy Roberts, an insurance adjuster who frequented bars popular with gay men. Roberts offered Bowles a place to stay in his beachfront home. Within days an argument erupted. Bowles later claimed Roberts had given him an ultimatum about a woman Bowles was seeing. Bowles picked up a lamp, smashed it over Roberts's head, beat him and strangled him. He forced a tightly rolled towel down the man's throat. He then stole Roberts's credit cards and car. Police found Bowles's fingerprints and a probation document bearing his name at the scene. An ATM camera also captured him trying to use Roberts's card. He became the primary suspect almost immediately, but he was already gone. He drove north. On April 14, 1994, in Wheaton, Montgomery County, Maryland, he killed 38-year-old David Jarman, a credit union employee. Jarman was beaten and strangled. Bowles took his money, credit cards and car and continued moving. A few weeks later he was in Savannah, Georgia. There he encountered 72-year-old Milton Bradley, a disabled World War II veteran known locally as a gentleman who fed pigeons and helped around a family locksmith shop. Bradley had suffered a wartime head injury and later undergone a lobotomy. Bowles accepted a ride and instead took Bradley to a golf course. Behind a plywood shed he beat the older man with a discarded toilet and suffocated him by stuffing leaves down his windpipe. Bradley's body was found on May 5. 8 days later, in Atlanta, 47-year-old Alverson Carter Jr. was found stabbed to death with a towel forced into his throat. Bowles kept traveling. In mid-May or early June he was in Hilliard, Nassau County, Florida. There he killed Albert Morris, a convenience store owner in his late 30s. Morris was gagged, beaten with a marble dish, shot in the chest with a shotgun and strangled. A towel was stuffed into his mouth. His parents discovered the body. By this point investigators in multiple states had begun connecting the cases. The victims were all gay men. The method, severe beating or stabbing followed by strangulation and the insertion of objects into the throat, was consistent. The geographic pattern followed I-95. Bowles was identified as the suspect in several of the killings. He continued to evade capture by using aliases, including the name Timothy Whitfield, and by moving constantly. In November 1994 he was living in the Jacksonville Beach area under the Whitfield name. He met 47-year-old florist Walter Jamel J. Hinton and soon moved into Hinton's mobile home. After a day and night of drinking and drugs, Bowles went outside, dug up a 40-pound concrete block, carried it back inside, and dropped it onto Hinton's head while the man slept. He then strangled Hinton and forced toilet paper and rags into his mouth and throat. Bowles remained in the trailer for several days while the body decomposed on the floor. On November 19 the FBI added Bowles to its 10 most wanted list. 3 days later, on November 22, he was arrested at a day labor office in Jacksonville. Under questioning he confessed to all 6 murders. He told investigators he had not wanted the killing to continue and that he had known he would eventually be caught. He was charged with the murder of Walter Hinton and later pleaded guilty. In 1996 a jury recommended death. He received the death penalty. The sentence was later vacated on procedural grounds and a new penalty phase was held. The death sentence was reimposed. While on death row he also pleaded guilty to the murder of John Hardy Roberts. Appeals continued for more than 2 decades. On August 22, 2019, Gary Ray Bowles was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Stark. He was 57 years old. The 6 men he killed were ordinary people living ordinary lives. Insurance adjusters, credit union employees, a disabled veteran, a florist, a store owner. Bowles used their willingness to offer food, work, or shelter as the opening he needed. Once inside he turned on them with sudden and extreme violence, then stripped their homes of cash, cards and vehicles and disappeared down the interstate. The objects forced into their throats became a grim signature that linked the cases across 3 states. For 8 months the corridor between Florida and Maryland was the hunting ground of a man who had already spent most of his adult life in and out of institutions and who chose his victims from a community that often had reason to be wary of the authorities. The combination of fingerprint evidence, probation papers left at the first scene, ATM footage, and the eventual placement on the FBI's most wanted list finally ended the series. The bodies of the 6 men remain the permanent record of what Gary Ray Bowles did during those months on I-95. Number 10. William George Bonin. William George Bonin was born on January 8, 1947 in Connecticut, into a family already rotting from the inside. His father was a compulsive gambler and an alcoholic, his mother frequently absent, leaving Bonin and his brother in the care of their grandfather, a convicted child molester. This was the man who raised him, who shaped his understanding of the world. By the age of 8, Bonin was already in trouble with the law, arrested for stealing license plates, which landed him in a juvenile detention center. It was there, behind bars, that the pattern of abuse continued. Older boys sexually assaulted him, cementing the cycle of violence that would define his entire existence. By his teenage years, Bonin had become a social outcast, uncomfortable around his peers, forming no friendships throughout his adolescence. He spent his time at a local bowling alley, isolated from the world. His emerging pedophilic urges became a source of constant conflict with his mother, leading to frequent, violent arguments. In 1966, he dropped out of high school and began molesting neighborhood children. His mother, in a pattern of denial that would continue for years, refused to acknowledge these acts, though she warned him constantly of the consequences. Eventually, she evicted him from their home. In December 1966, with his mother's encouragement, Bonin joined the United States Air Force. He was deployed to Vietnam as an aerial gunner, logging over 700 hours of combat and patrol time. He was even awarded a Good Conduct Medal for his service. But the war didn't tame him, it simply provided new opportunities for predation. Bonin later admitted to sexually assaulting 2 soldiers under his command at gunpoint during the Tet Offensive. When he returned home in 1968, his fiancée Linda had left him and married another man. The rejection, combined with his wartime experiences, left him frustrated and consumed by misanthropic beliefs. But he didn't waste time mourning. Within weeks of his discharge, he was already hunting. On November 17, 1968, Bonin picked up 14-year-old Billy Jones in Arcadia, California. He offered to take the boy home but instead handcuffed and raped him, knocking him unconscious. Just 9 days later, he picked up 17-year-old hitchhiker John Treadwell. Bonin produced a handgun, drove to a secluded area, raped him, then bludgeoned him with a tire iron. He threatened Treadwell, warning that if he told the man, Bonin's friends would avenge him. These crimes landed Bonin in a Atascadero State Hospital, where he was treated as a sex offender with a mental disorder. It was there, among other offenders, that Bonin made a chilling declaration. Fellow inmate Philip Gonzalez testified that Bonin repeatedly stated that if he ever found himself in a similar situation again, he would make sure they wouldn't take him alive, and if they did, he would leave no witnesses whatever. Another inmate, John Lonzo, testified that Bonin told him the same thing. This time, there would be no witnesses. Bonin explained that he would kill them if he had to. Despite being diagnosed as an extreme sociopath with antisocial personality disorder, sexual sadism disorder, and manic depression, and despite being labeled as highly likely to reoffend during psychotic breakdowns, Bonin was released from prison in June 1974 after medical professionals declared he was no longer a danger to the health and safety of others. They were catastrophically wrong. In December 1975, Bonin was back behind bars for the rape and forcible oral copulation of a 14-year-old boy. He served time at the California Men's Facility, but again he was released in 1978 with 18 months of supervised probation. He had shown notable progress in therapy, completed mathematics courses, and trained as a machinist. The system believed he was reformed. But Bonin had already made his decision. He reportedly told a friend that he had no intention of going back to prison, not because he was going to give up preying on youngsters, but because he had no intention of leaving witnesses. On May 28, 1979, Bonin committed his first confirmed murder. His victim was 14-year-old Thomas Lundgren, a hitchhiker who had the misfortune of crossing paths with the truck driver. Bonin kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and strangled the boy to death. He was assisted in this atrocity by his primary accomplice, 22-year-old Vernon Butts, a factory worker who boasted of being a wizard and slept in a coffin. The body was dumped, and Bonin realized he had found his calling. What followed was a year-long reign of terror that would claim the lives of at least 21 young men and boys, though the true number may be closer to 36. Bonin, now working as a truck driver, would cruise the freeways of Southern California in his customized Dodge van, hunting for victims. His preferred targets were teenage boys and young men, predominantly Latino or Caucasian, with slender builds, long hair, and pale skin. Most were hitchhikers, runaways, or male prostitutes, people who wouldn't be missed quickly. Bonin and his accomplices, he had at least 4 known associates, would typically hunt on Fridays and Saturdays. They would lure their victims into the van with offers of rides, money, sex, or drugs. Once inside, the nightmare would begin. The details of Bonin's crimes are almost unbearable to recount. He and his accomplices would overpower their victims, restraining them with wires, cords, and handcuffs. Then came the torture. Bonin used pliers, knives, wire coat hangers, and ligatures to inflict unimaginable pain. The victims were beaten, raped, and sodomized repeatedly. Bonin would often bite his victims, leaving teeth marks on their bodies. In at least one case, he bit into a victim's penis until it tore. The murder of 17-year-old Marcus Grabs, a German exchange student, stands as one of the most horrific. Grabs was hitchhiking along the Pacific Coast Highway when Bonin and Butts picked him up. He was sodomized, beaten, and stabbed 77 times, a number that speaks to the frenzy of the attack. His unclothed body was found the next day in Malibu, with an ignition wire wrapped around one ankle and an orange nylon cord around his head. 15-year-old Donald Hayden was another victim who suffered unspeakable brutality. He was stabbed, sexually assaulted, and strangled. His attackers attempted to slash his throat and cut off his testicles. 15-year-old Charles Miranda was killed with his own shirt. Bonin and accomplice Gregory Miley twisted the fabric using a jack handle in a corkscrew motion until the boy died. His body was discarded in an alleyway in downtown Los Angeles. A post-mortem examination revealed that a blunt object had been inserted into his rectum. 19-year-old Darren Lee Kendrick was lured into the van under the pretext of a drug deal. Bonin and Butts bound him and Butts sodomized him. Bonin turned up the volume of Butts' sound system to cover Kendrick's screams. They then forced chloral hydrate down his throat, causing caustic chemical burns. After Kendrick complained of dizziness, Bonin strangled him, and Butts drove an ice pick into his ear, fatally wounding his cervical spinal cord. On March 25, 1980, Bonin and another accomplice, William Pugh, abducted 15-year-old Harry Todd Turner. They lured him with an offer of $20 for sex. After binding and sodomizing him, Bonin bit into his penis until it tore, then ordered Pugh to beat him. Pugh bludgeoned the boy while Bonin watched, and then Bonin strangled him to death. Perhaps the most disturbing victim was 12-year-old James McCabe, the youngest of Bonin's confirmed victims. On February 3, 1980, Bonin and Gregory Miley abducted the boy, beat him, and strangled him to death with his own shirt. After the killing, Bonin turned to Miley and said, "Let's do another one." A few hours later, they abducted, raped, and killed 15-year-old Charles Miranda. 2 victims in a single day. For Bonin, it was just another Tuesday. Bonin's final victim was 18-year-old Stephen J. Wells, killed on June 2, 1980. Bonin was assisted by his new roommate, 18-year-old James Monroe, a homeless drifter Bonin had encountered while cruising for prostitutes. Monroe later testified that Bonin had informed him he wanted them both to abduct, sexually assault, and murder a hitchhiker. Hours after they killed Wells, police began surveilling Bonin. Bonin was under suspicion due to his criminal record. Police placed him under surveillance, and on June 11, 1980, they arrested him in the act of assaulting a 15-year-old boy inside his van. The reign of terror was finally over. In custody, Bonin confessed to abducting and killing 21 young men and boys. He showed absolutely no remorse. He told a reporter, "I couldn't stop killing. It got easier each time." Journalist Dave Lopez visited Bonin in jail and secured a confession. Bonin admitted to 21 killings and revealed that if he hadn't been caught, he wouldn't have stopped. The reporter described Bonin as a wolf in sheep's clothing. A man who seemed normal, even likable, but was a monster underneath. Vernon Butts, Bonin's primary accomplice, was charged with 6 murders. He had agreed to testify against Bonin in exchange for the death penalty being taken off the table. But on January 11, 1981, Butts hanged himself in his jail cell. His confession became inadmissible in court. Gregory Miley and James Monroe both pleaded guilty to taking part in 1 murder each. Miley received 25 years to life, and Monroe received 15 years to life. William Pugh received a 6-year sentence for manslaughter. Bonin's other accomplices would spend decades in prison. Bonin was tried for 12 murders in Los Angeles County and convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to death. He also faced trial for 4 more murders in Orange County: the killings of Lawrence Sharp, 17, Russell Rue, 15, Glenn Barker, 13, and Frank Fox, 17. The mothers of these victims testified about their sons' disappearances. Bonin spent 16 years on death row. During that time, he wrote books, drew art, and complained about his injured shoulder and how huge mobile phones were. On February 23, 1996, at San Quentin State Prison, William Bonin was executed by lethal injection, the first inmate in California to die by this method. His last meal: 2 large pepperoni and sausage pizzas, 3 pints of coffee ice cream, and 18 Coca-Colas. His final words: "I feel the death penalty is not an answer to the problems at hand. I feel it sends the wrong message to the youth of the country. Advice from a man who had raped and murdered 21 boys. One of the witnesses to the execution was a survivor who had been assaulted by Bonin. He said, "I can see him dead. He can't rape me anymore. He's dead." William Bonin was one of the most prolific and depraved serial killers in American history. His crimes were marked by a level of torture and sadism that shocked even hardened investigators. He was a man who was failed by every institution that could have stopped him: a broken family, a failed psychiatric system, a criminal justice system that released him time and time again. But ultimately, Bonin's legacy is not in his own story. It is in the victims, the boys and young men who were snatched from the streets, tortured, and discarded like garbage. Their names deserve to be remembered: Thomas Lundgren, Marcus Grabs, Donald Hayden, David Murillo, Charles Miranda, James McCabe, Harry Turner, Darren Kendrick, Stephen Wood, Lawrence Sharp, Sean King, Stephen Wells, and so many more. When asked what he would tell young people considering committing crimes, Bonin offered this advice: before they did that, they should go to a quiet place and think about it seriously. It was the closest thing to self-reflection he ever offered. But for the families of his victims, there is no quiet place. There is only the memory of the children they lost to a monster who wore the face of a man.